A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, Bashim Rakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching this truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Rukwai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I just wanted to read through a story in regards to one of our forefathers that's written in the book of Chronicles as well as Kings. And the king is named Uzziah. I think he also goes under another name of Azariah, right? So this is one of the kings that came later on, after the reign of King Solomon and King Solomon's son Rehoboam, right? And just a side tangent, this is one of the things, it's a very, very interesting story. I wanted to read through it, and, because a lot of our people, they like to, always talk about, we was kings and all this kind of stuff, right? Well, who are these kings? If you ask them, they don't know, right? Our people essentially have forgotten their resting place, right? They've forgotten their heritage. They don't consider that they are the people of this book, right? So I'm going to read an example of one of these kings, right? So I'll start off here in the book of Second Chronicles, and I want to read down, go through some of his highs and lows during his time of reign, right? So this is Second Chronicles chapter 26. I'll start at verse 1. And here, on the topic of the screen, it says Uzziah succeeds Amaziah in Judah, right? So we're going through the succession of different kings who reigned over Judah, right? Who reigned after, King Solomon, and the kingdom basically was split, right? So verse 1, here it says, Then all the people took of Judah Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in the room of his father Amaziah. And he built Eloth and restored it to Judah after the king slept with his fathers. 16 years old was Uzziah when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was also Jechaliah of Jerusalem. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah did. And he sought the Most High Yahweh in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding in the visions of the Most High. And as long as he sought the Lord, the Most High made him to prosper, right? So this is he wasn't actually an example of a good king, right? And because he actually sought the Lord, in as opposed to when you read through different examples of other kings, they did certain things that offended the Lord. And this is one of the things that people don't understand, is that it's, they think the ways that they live is right. Basically our people tend to lean upon their own understanding. As a matter of fact, let me go to Proverbs, actually. I think it's, hold on, let me just get a quick one here in Proverbs. Because, a lot of our people don't understand, when you try to live a life outside of the Lord, outside of having a fear of the Lord, you don't live a life essentially that is pleasing to the Lord. This is Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12, and it says, There is a way that which seemeth right unto a man, but at the end thereof are the ways of death, right? So, our people think that the way that they live is basically right in the sight of the Lord. But, what it leads to is death, decay, because they don't actually follow the proper instructions. They don't actually seek counsel from the Lord's prophets to be able to get understanding in regards to what is holy and versus what is profane, right? That is another job also of like a priest. A priest is responsible for teaching, our people what is holy versus what is profane. And the way a lot of our people live is very profane. It's very, you know, um, displeasing. The high holy days. I'm sorry, not the high holy days. The so-called holidays. The birthday celebrations. The lifestyle that they live, the alphabet lifestyle. Those ways are not pleasing unto the Lord, right? So, um, let me go back to the story. Just give me 1 second. This is verse 6. Second Chronicles 26, and it says here, and he went forth and warred with the Philistines and break down the wall of Gath and the wall of Jabneh and the wall of Ashdod, and built cities about Ashdod and among the Philistines. And the Most High helped him against the Philistines and the Arabians that dwelt in Gurbaal and the Menuhims. And the Ammonites gave gifts to Uzziah, and his name spread abroad even to the entering in of Egypt, for he strengthened himself exceedingly. So essentially, he had these Ammonites, bringing pain. Basically, what they were doing, they were paying tribute, right? Kind of like how when King David, he puts the heathens in subjection. They were bringing they were bringing like their substance, so to speak, right? This is you know that's a more proper way to rule, right? The heathens, they bring their substance to you. I think even King Solomon had that experience as well with the Queen of Sheba from Ethiopia, because I think she brought like spices and stuff like that. And what I mean, we weren't supposed to take on their ways, but they were bringing a lot of their riches towards the king, right? It says here, moreover, Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate and at the valley gate and at the turning of the wall, and fortified them. And he built towers in the desert and digged many wells, for he had much cattle, both in the low country and in the plains. Husbandmen also, vine dressers in the mountains and Carmel, for he loved husbandry, right? So, and these are things that people, you need people to be able to do a lot of these things, right? So, you know, my guess is, you need people to be able to tend to those vines. You need people to, pick those grapes, to harvest the land and so on and so forth. What I mean? You need people to be able to delegate certain tasks to, to be able to actually, make sure the society is functioning properly. That is the role. That's a good king. You know what I'm saying? That is a very a king who looks after the welfare of, basically his people, right? you know and then, those people, they follow. This is what happens when you have a righteous rulership, in set forth in place, because the people are basically not like mourning. When you compare and contrast it, like, to what's going on right here right now versus what's going on in like the American society. Basically, it's like, a lot of the people are mourning because, they don't actually have the resources, or enough of the resources, to take care of themselves, right? So, um let me continue on here. And it says, the whole number of the chief of their fathers. I'm sorry, I didn't read verse 11. Moreover, Uzziah had an host of fighting men, and went out to war by bands, according to the number of their account, by the hand of Jael, the scribe, and Messiah, the ruler, under the hand of Hananiah, one of the king's captains. So it says, the whole number of the chief of the fathers of the mighty men of valor were 2,600, and under their hand was an army 300,000, and 7,500 made war with mighty war power. And to help the king against the enemy. It says Uzziah prepared for them throughout the host of shields, all the host of shields and spears and helmets and habergeons and bows and slings to cast stones. So these are different what do you call it, parts of like armory that you would wear, to make sure that your soldiers are, well equipped, essentially in an army, right? So a good king basically takes care of their people, right? That's why Esau, when you compare it and contrast it, Esau is not, he's an unwise king, and the scriptures say that. The scriptures say an unwise king basically destroyed his people, because you have a lot of subjects under you, but you poison their living. You sow discord between the men and the women. You have gender wars. You don't actually promote family, but you promote things that are contrary, toward you actually break up families, right? And that's one of the things that the Lord hates, is somebody who essentially sows discord, among brethren, right? We have a lot of discord amongst tribes, right? So this is, when you compare it and contrast it to what Uzziah is doing here, versus the way how Esau rules. Esau is the type of person. As a matter of fact, let me just get I think that's in Sirach. One second. Let me, just to describe and compare and contrast rulerships, right? Because he really was a good ruler, speaking of Uzziah here, right? But I want to get to the point where he fell short. This is Sirach 10:3. You know, an unwise king, speaking of Esau here, destroyeth his people, but through the prudence of them which are on authority, the city shall be inhabited. So this is the results when you look at this kingdom, the way it's ran. It's the result of an unwise king who's destroying his people, right? And that destruction takes place in multiple forms. It's not just like, tossing, missiles and, weapons of mass destruction and stuff like that. Like, that's one avenue, because you can argue that about the so-called Palestinians, but it can take forms in very little forms, right? Down to the very clothing that, that you wear on your to cover yourself, to cover your skin, right? Polyester clothing, the air that you breathe, the water that you drink, because these are things that are principal things for a man's life, right? This is, like I said before, the discord between the button of heads between a lot of our men and women and so on and so forth. Like, it's not a society that's actually progressing. It's actually, well, just progressing really in wickedness, but it's actually not progressing at all, right? So going back to the point here, so this is Second Chronicles 26 verse 15, and it says, and he made in Jerusalem engines invented by cunning men to be on the towers upon bulwarks, to shoot arrows and great stones withal, and his name spread far abroad, for he was marvelously helped till he was strong, right? So he also had, he had a lot of talents, right? Because this is what happens, when you seek the Lord, you get understanding in regards to certain things, and then you know how to apply a lot of these things, right? Scriptures say wisdom is really the principal thing, right? This is so this is where he eventually starts to fall short, right? So the title here, it says the pride of Uzziah's undoing. So here it says, this is verse 16, but when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction, for he transgressed against the Lord Yahweh Bashem Shai, his power, and went into the temple of the Lord to burn incense upon the altar of incense, right? So it says, and Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him fourscore priests of the Lord that were valiant men. So you have one, and then you have fourscore. So a score is 20. So that's 80 priests. So that's a lot. That's a lot of people, right? Coming in after him, because okay, so here he is. He's a king, and now he's starting to burn incense unto taken away from the priestly duty, because the priests basically were consecrated to actually perform these duties, to burn incense and so on and so forth, right? That was one of the roles of a priest. They also would teach, the like I said before, they taught the law, they performed sacrifices, they did the anointing and so on and so forth, right? So, there's a lot of duties of a priest, they were specifically relegated to do, right? So this is verse 18 here, and this is what happens. And they withstood Uzziah the king, and said unto him, It appertaineth not unto thee, Uzziah, to burn incense unto the Lord, but the priest, the sons of Aaron, that are consecrated. So consecrated means to be, they're with they're basically they're made holy. As a matter of fact, let me get it. So they're con is with, sacred is sacred goes back to sacred. But let me, it doesn't hurt to always get it as well. Consecrate. Okay, so consecrate means, okay, so yes, it literally means, so con is with, and then sacrir means to declare sacred. So basically to make something sacred, so to make or declare sacred by certain ceremonies or rites. So in the sacred is here, it says hallowed. It says, or made by association with divinity or divine things by religious ceremony or sanction, right? So it says dedicated, holy. Let's see what's else here. Anoint, dedicate, right? So it's something that is made holy, right? So this is something, he wasn't supposed to do. But this is what happens. Check this out. This is, and it says, verse 19, and Uzziah was wroth. So he was angry, right? And it says, and he had a censer in his hand to burn incense while he was wroth with the priest. So take this in, and during all these things, so he reigned 52 years, right? So, he probably had a few good years in between where he was doing really, really well until, he began to actually do this thing that pertaineth not unto him, right? So I'm just going to jump to Exodus real quick. So this is Exodus 30:7, going into the altar, of incense, right? So it says here, and it says, and Aaron shall burn thereon sweet incense every morning when he dresseth the lamps, and he shall burn incense upon it. And when Aaron lighteth the lamps at even, he shall burn incense upon it, a perpetual incense before the Lord throughout your generations, right? So this was a role that was consecrated, relegated specifically, for the priests, right? It wasn't just for somebody just to go into the tabernacle, this so, to do, and they just start playing the role of a priest. No, right? So this is what happens, and he eventually he transgressed. Speaking of the King Uzziah here, right? So this is verse 20, and it says here, and Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked upon him. Oh, verse 19, I'm sorry, I didn't finish reading that. And it says, had a censer in his hand to burn incense, and while he was wroth with the priest, the leprosy even arose on his forehead before the priest in the house of the Lord, right? So the Lord smote him with leprosy, right? And it says, and Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked upon him and saw he was leprous on his forehead, and they thrust him out of thence. and himself hasted also to go out because the Lord had smitten him. So he didn't even listen. So the Lord was on the side of the priests, because he was doing something he wasn't supposed to do. So he was having a good cut, he was having a good run, feeling himself and so on and so forth. The Lord gave him understanding in regards to weaponry and husbandry and so on and so forth, right? So, and this is a king, right? So this is before the Babylonians actually came in and destroyed the house of the Lord. And in the house of the Lord, they had all these like gold and silver vessels and stuff like that. So there was a lot of riches, right? That the house of the Lord had, right? So it's not like he was lacking in any particular way in terms of like finances, right? So, but he started to transgress and do something that he wasn't supposed to do, right? So, what can we take from this? Let's go to Romans, because it mentioned that portion of pride, and there's something in the Apocrypha that says pride is when somebody departs ultimately from their maker. This is Romans chapter 12 verse 3, and it says, "For I say, excuse me, through the grace given unto me, that every man that is among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, so clear-minded, according as the Most High has dealt to every man the measure of faith," right? So, there is a certain sort of mentality to have, and having that basically a humble sort of mentality, because this is part of the that's why a lot of our people are going to get a very, very harsh judgment, because they think they know more than the Lord, so they spew out all these different things, saying all kinds of manner of nonsense, right? And I think it says that in Timothy too, in regards to the last days. These things, one of the things it would increase is like pride, if I'm not mistaken, right? That is the vibration of Babylon. That is what Babylon. This culture doesn't promote humility. It doesn't promote self-examination. It doesn't promote temperance. Looking within yourself. It doesn't promote a lot of these fruits of the spirit, right? That's just, and that's it. That is the culture that Babylon pushes. It pushes pride, me, you know um thinking about myself only, not actually being considerate, and this is really far from our culture. Speaking about Babylonian culture, it's very, very far in terms of, because when you go into a lot of our customs and our culture, like for example, gleaning grapes and stuff like that. Like when you had a harvest, so say for example in the ancient times, you had, say for example, you had a vineyard, and back then, what you would do is you would leave a portion, of that vineyard, like, so basically people who were sojourning, so like Israelites that were sojourning, or if you had widows, women that lost their husbands, or if you had orphans, in that event, by keeping that law, it made sure that those people had food to eat, right? But also keeping that law, it forced you to be considerate anyway, because we're supposed to be a culture that looks out for one another, looks out for our own, right? But pride is the complete opposite, where you just think about, it's just about you and so on and so forth, right? um so let's finish off the story. Just give me 1 second. This is verse 21, and it says, and Uzziah the king was a leper until the day of his death, and dwelt in the house, in a several house, being a leper, and he was cut off from the house of the Lord. And Jotham his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. And the rest of Uzziah, of the acts of Uzziah, first and last, did Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, write. And Uzziah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of the burial which belonged to the kings, for they said he was a leper, and Jotham the son reigned in his stead. Right? So, it's really pride, because really and truly, we have had, I myself, had, moments of that, you know, and we think, we know, and then sometimes, we get opened up to certain, kind of levels of understanding, and we start feeling ourselves sometimes, so it's just something, just to be mindful of, right? Because it's not like he wasn't, the king, speaking of here, he wasn't intelligent. He was very intelligent. He had understanding in regards to husbandry and soil, and weapons and weaponry and stuff like that, right? um so that's pretty much the point. I kind of just wanted to read that, because it can still happen to us, even though we don't have those physical things, the Lord gives us understanding in regards to, certain things, right? So, that pride can always be, at that door knocking, if you're not being mindful, of yourself, right? That's why I personally, that's why I think sometimes the Lord puts us in situations that would force us to be humble. So one of the things I've noticed, even for myself, and I'll just say this, is that, when you're in situations, sometimes the Lord will put us in a situation that would kind of like force us to kind of like be humble, so we still need him, right? Because in the Sirach, it says what pride is when one departs from their maker, right? So you think you can do it all by yourself, and so on and so forth, right? We need guidance ultimately, right? We need, we have weaknesses. This is why, and Paul actually mentioned this too as well, in regards to certain revelations. He was given understanding to all these mysteries, right? But there was a thorn, right? It doesn't specifically say what it was, but it was probably just something there, to kind of keep him in check, right? So a thorn can be, it could be like in your environment, or it could be within your body. You know what I'm saying? To kind of like keep you, humble, right? To, because the Lord gives us understanding in regards to abundance of, mysteries and revelations, and, so on and so forth, dreams, right? So, you know, with all that, pride can also seep in at some point, but it's just something just to be mindful of, right? But that's pretty much the point. Lord's will, this is just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, all glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim El Shai. Till next time, I say Shalom.